Well, if you remember all the way back to the second lesson of this study, we walked you through Old Testament reminders of a rest that was lost in the Garden of Eden at the fall of man, right? My suggestion was that Adam's kicked out, humanity's ability to be at rest with God is lost at that moment, but God doesn't want them to forget this isn't the way it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be different than what it is. And so I suggested to you that as we walk through the Old Testament, God put in place reminders of that state of rest that had been lost. And let me just remind you, in Exodus, early in Exodus, we find manna in the wilderness. This is the first idea of Sabbath. Collect a double portion on day 6. Don't work on the 7th, right? It's before the 10 Commandments. Manna in the wilderness. Exodus 20 was kind of the next thing I took you to, the 4th commandment, the actual 7th day Sabbath. Leviticus 23, we went there and we saw that in addition to just every 7th day, there were other days scattered throughout the calendar attached to these festivals. And they were Sabbath days as well. They weren't necessarily the Sabbath, the 7th day, 4th commandment Sabbath, but they were Sabbath days. That's how they're described. And then in addition to this ever-expanding idea of rest, these reminders of rest in the Old Testament, we went to not just days, one day a week or several more days a year, but we went to a whole year of Sabbath rest, right? A sabbatical year. And then we kind of ended in chapter 25 of Leviticus with this crazy year of Jubilee, right? Where it's a big reset button. Everything goes back to the way it was originally done. It's a picture of going back to this Edenic state, okay? The way it was before the fall. But it didn't end just there. We took you through the language of the Old Testament all the way through Joshua, bringing them into the land after the ministry of Moses, right? And the land itself is referred to as a land of rest. So it's not just what the people are doing, the observance of the law, but it's a place to be as well. A place to be and a thing to do that's restful. It's where it's a picture, it's a reminder of that lost state in Eden. Okay, that's a quick reminder. What I'm going to try and do for you really quickly here at the end of our time is I'm going to walk you through what Jesus does to interact with all of those Old Testament reminders of rest. Let me say that again, because this is going to go fast. I walked you through on week 2 this progression of the reminders. And if these are really reminders that Jesus is the fulfillment of, you would expect him to interact with these concepts in his ministry. We've already seen some of them, but I'm going to kind of line them up the way I just presented them to you out of the Old Testament. What was the first one out of the Old Testament? It was manna in the wilderness. Sound familiar at all? Jesus interact with manna in the wilderness? Well, yeah. If we just turn to John chapter 6 really quick, we find ourselves in what's called the bread of life discourse. It's a long teaching of Jesus where he uses this bread analogy. He's just fed lots of people, thousands of people, right? And some of those people are seeking him out. Turns out because they're hungry and want to get more food. And Jesus has a good conversation. Verse 32 of chapter 6 in John. Truly, truly, I say to you, it is not Moses who has given you bread out of heaven, but it is my Father who gives you true bread out of heaven. Well, what is that? For the bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world. Who's that? It's Jesus himself. If we skip down to 49 through 51, your fathers. You would expect Jesus to interact with the reminders of rest and somehow come into its fulfillment, right? Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread which comes down out of heaven. I am the living bread that came down out of... I am this idea of manna. You feed on me, and this idea of rest is incorporated within your meals. In other words, if anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. The bread also which I give for the life of the world is my flesh. Jesus interacts with the reminder of the manna rest. Matthew 12. We just went through this in detail. The fourth commandment, the seventh-day Sabbath. The Pharisees are challenging him on the practicality of what he's doing and how he's not following the fourth commandment. And what's his conclusion out of this passage? Here it is. The Son of Man is, I am the fourth commandment. Right? Squashes that pretty quickly. What was the next? So we've got manna, we've got the fourth commandment in Exodus 20. What about the additional Sabbath days attached to festivals? Well, what we find, and this isn't maybe a little more covert and maybe not as overt as you'd like, but what we find is in John chapter 5, after these things there was a feast of the Jews, a feast. Do you know what that is? Leviticus 23, it's a festival of the Jews. It's one of those festivals that has what attached to it? Additional Sabbath days. There's a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem because it's an ingathering feast, and that's what you're supposed to do out of Leviticus 23, the law that's found there. And there's a healing here at the pool of Bethesda during a festival Sabbath day. How do I know that? Because down here it says, now after all that thing, this is the pick up your pallet and walk. This is the healing, right? Verse 9 down here in John 5, it says, now it was the Sabbath day, the Sabbath on that day. It might sound like it was the seventh day Sabbath because the word "the" is there, the particle. But if you go behind the translation, there's no "the" in the original. That's been added for our translation. And it's, I think, unfortunate in this case. I think what we have a picture of is Jesus goes up, there's a feast, he's going up to Jerusalem, and he does this thing. Now, it was a Sabbath on that day. It doesn't say the Sabbath. It was a Sabbath, which suggests to me that this is maybe one of those additional Sabbath days that's tacked on to festivals, in addition to the seventh-day Sabbath. Right? Okay, that can be debated. We'll move on quickly so you don't think about it too much. What's next after the additional Sabbath days? Yeah, sabbatical year. And tied in with that is that crazy year of the year of Jubilee, right? We discussed this in your lesson, but in Luke chapter 4, Jesus is teaching in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he gets up and he opens the scroll of Isaiah and he finds the place where it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. Now I'm going to suggest to you, if you didn't get this answer out of your lesson, Isaiah, the language in Isaiah that he's quoting is referring to the year of Jubilee. Okay, how do we know that? Well, there's some clues. To preach the gospel, the good news, that's what gospel means, good news to the poor. What is good news if you are poor? That you're not poor anymore, right? That your debts have been canceled, that you are on even ground with everybody else. What does that sound like? Yeah, that's the year of Jubilee. That's the reset button, right? He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives. Captives of what? Well, it's slavery idea, but it's the financial slavery that is the release on the year of Jubilee. Okay, if you find yourself in servitude because of whatever's happened in the last 50 years, reset button, you're free. Okay? Recovery of sight to the blind, to set those who are free, those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. Favorable year of the Lord. That's the year of Jubilee. And what does Jesus say about this? Today, this passage has been, and there's the language again, fulfilled. The teaching from the Old Testament. I'm not here to abolish it and get rid of it. What they taught in the Old Testament, the plan of salvation of humankind by God, I'm here to fulfill that. I am here to be that salvation, is what Jesus is saying. He interacts with not just the sabbatical year idea, but the whole year of Jubilee. Now, if that's not it, because I suggested it even went to beyond the year of Jubilee into Joshua and the entrance of the land, the ministry of Moses coming out of Egyptian slavery and the ministry of Joshua entering the land, this land of rest. This is going to be a little more obscure, But I'm going to take you to Luke chapter 9, verse 28. It's the transfiguration. And Luke is unique in the way he describes certain parts of this. That's why we're in Luke. If you remember the transfiguration, I'm not going to go into great detail on it, but Jesus takes three up on the mountain with him. When he gets up there, there's a cloud comes down, and Moses and Elijah show up. Moses shows up, top of a mountain. Sound familiar? Should sound familiar. Who's up there with him? Elijah, a prophet, and Joshua. Do you remember Jesus' name is Joshua, Jesus? It's the same word. When the instructions were given to Jesus' parents to name him, the name is, you are to call him Joshua. And with that comes a whole slew of word pictures out of the Old Testament. Mostly a ministry of bringing people into a land of rest. That's what Joshua did. So Moses and Joshua, Jesus, are up on a mountain, and they're talking about, verse 31, they were speaking about, and in this NASB it says his departure, Jesus' departure. But it's interesting, if you go behind the translation, that word for departure, it's Exodus. Moses and Joshua are discussing the Exodus that Jesus was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, when it's departure, we think that he's going to die, he's going to come back from the grave, and he's going to go up to heaven. That's his departure. Whoa, got a little excited about that one. That's what our translation lets us think. But in reality, what is it saying? It's saying that Jesus, Joshua, has a ministry of an exodus that he's about to accomplish. What is that exodus? It's an exodus out of slavery. This is Pauline language out of the New Testament. It's out of slavery to sin into a land of, a promised land, a land of rest. Jesus is interacting with not just the shadows or the reminders of rest that the law provides, but the ministry of Moses and Joshua from the Old Testament, the shadows of who he is there to fulfill their ministry. But it's not physical Israel out of physical Egypt into a promised land. That didn't work, right? We get that story out of the Old Testament. It's a much better ministry. It's a much better land. And I took you to Revelation at the end, because the end of Revelation describes this new city, this new land, this promised land that is the restored Eden, but fully populated, okay? It's not just Adam and Eve in it, it's fully populated. What Adam and Eve were supposed to do is be fruitful and multiply and expand the borders so it encompasses the whole world. And that's what we find in this picture at the end of Revelation. It's a restored Eden where the tabernacle of God is among men. That's Jesus himself. He is there acting as the presence of God as he walks and dwells among them. And listen to this. This is great. God himself will be among them, verse 4 of Revelation 21. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. When did tears start? It's part of the curse, right? And there will no longer be any death. When did death start? It's part of the curse, right? There was no longer be any mourning or crying or pain, toil. This is the curse. There will no longer be any of that. The first things have passed away, and he who sits on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new, like they were in the beginning." That's not just the physicality of the land that is new, it's the relationship between humanity and God. It's a relationship of rest that we see at the end of Revelation. It finishes in chapter 21, verse 25. In the daytime, for there will be no light. Little parenthetical statement there. Its gates will never be closed, and they will bring the glory of and the honor of the nations into it, and nothing unclean, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, like the serpent in the garden, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Notice, don't go too fast past this. Its gates will never be closed. There are gates, it's a city, that they would have understood in that context. Not like our cities, we don't have gates necessarily the way they did. But the gates are never closed, which means what? When do you close gates? The only reason you close gates is to make a continuous wall around your city to protect yourself from your enemies. And there are no enemies, so the gates are never closed. It is a city at complete rest. It's a picture of rest, and rest means functionality. It doesn't mean they're not doing anything. They are yoked to God, and they're walking alongside God, and they are doing what they were intended to do. It's a comfortable existence. It's what they were meant to do. It's a great ministry that Jesus has. It's more than a reminder of rest that Jesus brings. He invites us to see him as the fulfillment of all of the reminders. He is our rest. But practically, and here's the problem, practically, what does that mean? How is it that we observe that Sabbath if he is Sabbath? And how do we do that this side of heaven? I might understand how it could happen that side of heaven, but what does it even mean to experience Sabbath this side of heaven if we're to look to Jesus as the fulfillment of that idea? Well, that's what we're going to unpack in the remaining weeks of our class. Look forward to it.